In the glittering heart of the city's most exclusive charity gala, a woman's entire world shattered with the sound of tearing silk and one man's unwavering gaze that refused to let cruelty hide in shadows. The Harrington Grand Hotel had never looked more magnificent. Crystal chandeliers cascaded light across marble floors like waterfalls of diamonds. Designer gowns swept past champagne fountains where each glass cost more than most people's monthly rent. This was where the city's elite gathered not to give, but to be seen giving, where charity was a photo opportunity and compassion was a tax deduction. Evelyn Harrington moved through this world like she owned it, because in many ways she did. Her husband's name was on the building. Her face graced society pages. Her opinions, no matter how shallow or cruel, were treated as gospel by those desperate to remain in her orbit. She had everything: wealth, status, power, beauty maintained by the best surgeons money could buy. Everything except the one thing that mattered most: the ability to see other people as human. When Naomi Carter walked through those gilded doors that evening, elegant in navy blue silk that caught the light just so, carrying herself with quiet dignity, the world did not pause to notice. She wore no labels screaming for attention, no diamonds heavy enough to announce her worth. To the crowd of privilege surrounding her, this meant only one thing: she must be staff. And for Evelyn Harrington, watching from her throne of assumed superiority, that single false assumption would become the match that burned her entire empire to ash. Because what Evelyn didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know as she prepared to humiliate a woman she'd decided wasn't worthy of basic respect, was that her husband stood in the shadows at the far end of that glittering ballroom, watching, seeing everything. And for the first time in their marriage, seeing his wife exactly as she was. This is the story of one moment, one act of casual cruelty captured by dozens of cameras, one assumption that cost a woman everything she'd spent a lifetime building, and one man who finally understood that silence in the face of injustice makes you complicit in the crime. The gala had been planned for months, the guest list curated with surgical precision, every detail designed to impress, to dazzle, to remind the city's elite exactly where they stood in the hierarchy that governed their world. But by the end of the night, that hierarchy would be shattered. By the end of the night, the woman who thought she could destroy someone's dignity would discover that cameras remember what crowds forget. By the end of the night, Evelyn Harrington would learn that some tears, like the ones in the fabric she was about to rip, can never be mended. And it all began with a single glance, a look of contempt, a moment of cruelty that would be replayed 1,000,000 times across social media, dissected in news segments, and used as evidence in a courtroom. The chandelier light caught Naomi's face as she moved carefully through the crowd, unaware that she'd just stepped into someone else's warped narrative, unaware that Evelyn Harrington had already decided who she was, what she was worth, and how she should be treated, unaware that this night would change everything, for both of them, but in ways only one of them could have predicted.
The ballroom of the Harrington Grand Hotel glowed with the kind of light that only obscene wealth could buy. Not harsh, not bright, just perfect. The kind of illumination that made everyone look 10 years younger and $20,000 richer. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks, each one worth more than a luxury car. The marble floor had been polished to such perfection that it reflected the crowd like a mirror, doubling the impression of grandeur. This was where donors came to be seen, not to be kind, where charity was performance art and compassion was measured in tax-deductible increments. Naomi Carter stepped through the entrance with the kind of grace that came from years of moving through spaces that didn't want her. Her navy blue dress was elegant but understated, silk that flowed rather than screamed, a neckline that suggested confidence without demanding attention. No diamonds dripped from her ears or throat, no designer logo announced her worth. She'd chosen the dress deliberately, knowing that in rooms like this, being overlooked was often safer than being noticed. She moved carefully, her eyes scanning the crowd with the practiced awareness of someone who'd learned young that survival sometimes meant reading a room before the room could read you. She avoided the groups clustered around the champagne fountains, the circles of laughter that seemed to have invisible barriers around them. She wasn't carrying a serving tray, but no one noticed. In spaces like this, people rarely saw what they expected not to exist. She was looking for the registration table, where her name, Naomi Carter, invited guest of Richard Harrington himself, would be checked off a list that would prove she belonged here, that she wasn't an intruder in this world of privilege and presumption. She never made it that far. Evelyn Harrington stood near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by her usual court of admirers and enablers. She wore crimson, a dress that cost more than most people's cars, cut to display a body maintained by personal trainers and careful starvation. Her blonde hair was styled in waves that looked effortless but had required 2 hours and a celebrity stylist. Diamonds glittered at her throat, her wrists, her ears, a fortune in stones that announced to everyone exactly who mattered in this room. She was holding court, as she always did at these events, telling some story about a vacation in Tuscany or a shopping trip to Paris. Her audience laughed at the appropriate moments, gasped on cue, performed the social choreography that kept them in her good graces. And then Naomi brushed past her chair. Not rudely, not aggressively, just moving through the space that existed between tables, the route that anyone would naturally take to reach the other side of the ballroom. But to Evelyn, whose world was defined by invisible hierarchies and unspoken rules, the audacity of this woman, this clearly low-status woman, given her lack of obvious wealth signifiers, moving through her space as if she had every right to be there? Unacceptable. "Excuse me," Evelyn's voice cut through the ambient chatter like a knife through silk. Naomi paused, turned politely. Years of customer service jobs, of navigating hostile spaces, of surviving encounters with people who saw her as less than, had taught her the careful choreography of deference without surrender. "Yes." Evelyn stood, her movement graceful, but her expression anything but. Her eyes traveled up and down Naomi's form with the kind of assessment usually reserved for livestock at auction, taking in the simple dress, the absence of jewelry, the natural hair pulled back in an elegant bun that required no expensive salon visit. And she made her decision. "What do you think you're doing walking through here like that?" Her voice carried across nearby tables, drawing attention like blood in water draws sharks. "Staff entrances are in the back, and if you need to move through the main ballroom, you use the perimeter. You don't walk directly through the guests' seating." The surrounding guests leaned in, not to defend Naomi, not to correct Evelyn's obvious mistake, but to watch. Because in their world, someone else's humiliation was entertainment, a story to tell later, a moment of drama to break up the monotony of another charity gala where they'd write another check to feel better about their wealth. Naomi felt the weight of those stares, felt the assumption rippling through the crowd like a virus spreading, felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came from being seen but not truly seen, labeled but not known, judged but not heard. She opened her mouth to respond, to explain, to produce the invitation that was folded carefully in the small clutch she carried, to say the words that would correct this misunderstanding before it escalated further. But Evelyn didn't wait for a response. Because in her world, people like Naomi, People she'd decided were beneath her didn't deserve explanations. They deserved lessons. "You people are getting bold," Evelyn's voice said loudly, her voice now pitched to ensure maximum audience reach. "Walking through here like you belong, like you're guests instead of hired help." She stepped closer, invading Naomi's space with the confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences for cruelty. "Did you think you could just blend in? Did you think no one would notice?" Naomi's hands tightened on her clutch. "I'm not." "Save it." Evelyn's hand shot out, faster than anyone expected, grabbing the fabric of Naomi's dress at the shoulder. "Maybe a little reminder will help you remember your place." Time seemed to slow down. Naomi's eyes widened in shock. Several guests gasped. Someone's phone came out, starting to record what would become the most viral moment of the year. And before anyone could intervene, before Naomi could step back, before a single person in that crowd of hundreds could find the courage to say, "Stop," Evelyn Harrington pulled hard.
The sound of tearing fabric cut through the ballroom like a scream. Silk ripped from shoulder to waist, the careful seams that had held Naomi's dress together giving way under Evelyn's vicious pull. The navy blue fabric split, exposing skin, exposing the simple bra underneath, exposing more than clothes, exposing the casual cruelty that lived in the hearts of people who'd never been told no. Naomi stumbled backward, her hands flying up to clutch the torn edges of her dress, trying to hold together what had just been destroyed. Her face showed pure shock, mouth open, eyes wide, frozen in the moment between assault and comprehension. The ballroom exploded with gasps. Phones lifted like a forest of glowing trees, everyone capturing the moment, everyone documenting the spectacle, but not to help, not to defend, to preserve, to share, to turn another person's humiliation into content. Evelyn stepped back, breathing hard, her face flushed with a mixture of exertion and satisfaction. She smoothed her own perfect crimson dress, tucked a strand of blonde hair behind her ear, and exhaled like she'd just completed an unpleasant but necessary task. "There," she said, her voice cutting through the shocked silence. "Now maybe you'll remember where you belong." Naomi stood there, hands clutching torn fabric, trying to hold together her dignity along with her dress. Her chest heaved with the effort of controlling her breathing, of not crying, of not giving this woman and this crowd the satisfaction of seeing her break. The silence that followed was deafening. Hundreds of people, hundreds of witnesses, and not a single person stepped forward, not to help Naomi cover herself, not to hand her a jacket or a shawl, not to tell Evelyn Harrington that what she'd just done was assault, was criminal, was inexcusable regardless of who she thought Naomi was. They just stared and filmed and whispered to each other behind raised hands. Evelyn looked around at her audience, reading their silence as approval, as validation, as proof that she'd been right to put this woman, this interloper who dared to walk through her space, in her proper place. She smiled, actually smiled, a small, satisfied curve of lips that probably cost thousands in fillers. "Someone escort her out," she said dismissively, waving her hand like she was shooing away an annoying insect. "Through the service entrance this time, and find out who hired her. I want to make sure she never works another event in this city." Security started moving toward Naomi, not quickly, not urgently, but moving nonetheless, because Evelyn Harrington had given an order, and in the Harrington Grand Hotel, her word was law. Or so everyone thought. Naomi's hands trembled as she held her dress together. She could feel the air conditioning on her exposed skin, could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes, treating her like a spectacle instead of a person, could feel the familiar weight of injustice, of being judged, labeled, and dismissed based on assumptions that had nothing to do with who she actually was. But beneath the shock, beneath the humiliation, something else was rising. Not anger, though that would have been justified. Not shame,
because she'd done nothing wrong. Something colder, something harder. Understanding. Understanding that this moment, this assault, this violation had been captured by dozens of cameras, that Evelyn Harrington had just committed a crime in front of witnesses, and the woman who thought she was teaching a lesson was about to learn one herself. Naomi lifted her head, met Evelyn's eyes directly, and despite the torn dress, despite the exposed skin, despite everything that had just happened, she stood her ground. "I'm not staff," she said quietly, clearly, her voice steady despite the chaos of emotion swirling inside her. The nearby guests leaned in, caught between entertainment and confusion. Evelyn's expression twisted into something ugly. "Please, don't embarrass yourself further." She looked at the security guards who'd stopped a few feet away. "Just take her out. I don't have time for delusional help who thinks—" "I'm a guest," Naomi interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "I was invited. My name is on the list." A murmur rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Phones shifted angle, sensing the story was evolving into something even more interesting than simple humiliation. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. For a brief moment, something that might have been doubt flickered across her face, but it was quickly replaced by certainty, by the kind of unshakable conviction that came from never having to doubt herself, never having to question whether she might be wrong. "Security!" she snapped, her voice sharper now, more desperate. "I don't care what delusion she's operating under. She's clearly disturbed. Get her out of my hotel before—" "Before what?" The voice came from the back of the ballroom, male, calm, quiet in a way that somehow carried more weight than Evelyn's shrieking ever could. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, and Richard Harrington stepped into view.
Richard Harrington hadn't moved in over 5 minutes. He'd been standing at the far end of the ballroom, near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city's glittering skyline, a glass of untouched champagne in his hand, and an expression of careful neutrality on his face. He came to these events because he had to, because his name was on the building and his donations funded half the charities in the city, and his presence was expected. But he'd never enjoyed them, had never liked the performative nature of charity in rooms like this, where the cost of a single dress could feed a family for a year, and everyone congratulated themselves for their generosity, while their hired staff worked double shifts for poverty wages. He attended, he donated, he smiled for photos, and he watched. He'd been watching when Naomi Carter walked in, had recognized her immediately, of course. He'd personally invited her, had spent weeks coordinating her attendance at this gala, specifically because her work with underserved communities deserved recognition, deserved visibility in a room full of people who could actually make a difference if they chose to see beyond their own privilege. He'd watched her navigate the ballroom with careful grace, had noticed how she moved around the edges, avoiding confrontation, trying to reach the registration table where her name would confirm what should have been obvious to everyone. She belonged here. He'd seen his wife intercept her, and he'd seen everything that followed. The assumption, the accusation, the grab, the rip. He'd watched his wife of 15 years commit assault in front of hundreds of witnesses, her face twisted with contempt, her voice dripping with the kind of casual racism that she'd probably learned to disguise in public, but clearly couldn't contain when she thought she was among her own. He'd watched the crowd do nothing. And something inside him, something that had been cracking for years, fracturing under the weight of endless social obligations and meaningless conversations, and the slow realization that he'd married a woman who viewed human worth as something measured in bank balances and zip codes, finally broke. Not loudly. Richard Harrington never did anything loudly, but completely. He set down his champagne glass on a nearby table. The small click of crystal on marble was barely audible, but to him it felt like a door closing, or opening. He wasn't sure which yet. And he started walking.
The crowd sensed the shift before they saw him, a change in the atmospheric pressure of the room, a sudden awareness that something was about to happen, that the story they'd been watching was about to take a turn no one had anticipated. People stepped aside without being asked, creating a path from the windows to the center of the ballroom, where Evelyn stood, still flushed with satisfaction, still convinced she'd done something admirable. Where Naomi stood, clutching torn fabric, her eyes still defiant despite everything. Richard walked slowly, each step measured, each footfall deliberate. He didn't rush, didn't need to. His presence alone commanded attention in a way his wife's never would, no matter how loudly she demanded it. His jaw was tight, not with explosive anger. He'd learned long ago that real power didn't need to shout, but with something colder, something harder, disappointment refined into something sharp enough to cut. The crowd watched him approach. Some recognized the expression on his face and started backing away, suddenly eager to distance themselves from whatever was about to happen. Others, slower to read the room, continued filming, sensing viral gold. Evelyn didn't notice him at first. She was too busy directing security, too occupied with ensuring this embarrassing disturbance was removed from her gala, too convinced of her own righteousness to pay attention to the man who owned everything she thought gave her power. It wasn't until the security guards stopped moving, their eyes fixed on something behind her, that she finally turned and found her husband standing 5 feet away, looking at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Not love, not even the polite affection that had characterized their marriage for the past decade. Something else entirely. Recognition. The kind that comes when you finally see someone exactly as they are, stripped of the comfortable lies you've been telling yourself to avoid the truth. "Richard!" Evelyn's voice brightened immediately, her tone shifting from command to charm in an instant. She'd always been good at that, reading a room, adjusting her performance, playing whatever role the moment required. "Can you believe this woman tried to—" "Stop talking." The words were quiet, barely above a whisper, but they cut through Evelyn's practiced charm like a scalpel through skin. She blinked, confused. Richard never spoke to her like that, never contradicted her in public. Their marriage worked because he stayed in his world, business, charity, the actual work of managing their fortune, and she stayed in hers, social climbing, event planning, maintaining the image that kept them relevant in circles that mattered. But right now, looking at her husband's face, Evelyn felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. Uncertainty. Richard's eyes moved from her to Naomi. His expression softened immediately, not with pity, because that would have been its own form of insult, but with something that looked almost like apology. He walked past his wife without another glance, past the security guards who'd frozen in confusion, past the phones still recording everything. He stopped directly in front of Naomi Carter. And without a word, he removed his tuxedo jacket and draped it gently around her shoulders. The jacket was expensive, custom-tailored, probably worth more than Naomi's rent for 3 months, but he placed it over her torn dress with the kind of careful respect usually reserved for something precious, adjusting it so it covered the exposed skin, making sure it sat properly on her shoulders, treating her in that moment with more dignity than her wife had shown to anyone in years. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, just to her. "You should never have had to endure that." Then he turned back to Evelyn, and the entire ballroom held its breath.
Richard looked at his wife with the kind of calm that precedes devastation, the kind of quiet that comes right before the storm destroys everything in its path. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a conversation volume, but somehow reaching every corner of that massive ballroom. "Did you just assault my invited guest?" The words landed like bombs. Phones shifted focus. Guests who'd been slowly backing away froze, suddenly unwilling to miss whatever came next. Evelyn's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, the dawning realization that she might have made a mistake, then, desperately, denial. "Richard, I don't know what she told you, but—" "I watched you do it," he interrupted, still calm, still quiet, but now there was steel underneath the words, the tone of a man who'd built an empire through careful control, finally deciding to deploy that power. "I watched you assume, accuse, grab, and tear. I watched you commit assault on a woman whose only crime was walking through a public space in a dress you decided wasn't expensive enough to grant her humanity." A murmur rippled through the crowd, not supportive whispers anymore. Nervous energy, the kind that comes when people start realizing they might be standing on the wrong side of history and the cameras are capturing everything. "She wasn't wearing proper. I thought she looked like—" Evelyn stumbled over words, each excuse dying before it fully formed because even she could hear how they sounded, how transparent, how damning. "She looked like what?" Richard asked. "Say it. Finish that sentence. Let everyone hear exactly what you were thinking." Evelyn's mouth opened, closed. Her eyes darted around the ballroom, looking for support, for someone to intervene, for her usual court of enablers to rush to her defense. But they were backing away, distancing themselves, because they'd just realized that the woman they'd been fawning over for years, the woman whose approval they'd courted and whose displeasure they'd feared, had just committed a crime on camera in a room full of people who'd happily throw her under the bus to protect themselves. Social calculus is cruel, but efficient. Richard turned slightly, addressing the crowd now, his voice still controlled but carrying weight like a judge delivering a verdict. "Naomi Carter is the founder and executive director of Compass Youth Services, an organization that has helped over 3,000 young people exit homelessness and enter stable housing and employment. She's a graduate of Columbia University and holds a master's degree from Harvard Kennedy School. She's been featured in Forbes, in Time magazine, and on 60 Minutes for her groundbreaking work." He paused, letting that sink in, letting the crowd absorb exactly who they'd just watched being humiliated. "I personally invited her to this gala, personally, because her work deserves recognition from people like us who have resources to make a difference, because she represents everything charity is supposed to be about, actually helping people rather than performing generosity for social credit." His gaze swept the room, landing on faces that suddenly couldn't meet his eyes. "And every single one of you watched my wife assault her, tear her clothing, humiliate her publicly, and not one of you intervened, not one of you said stop, not one of you offered her help." The silence was crushing now. Phones were being lowered, faces turned away. Suddenly no one wanted to be caught on camera as part of this story. Too late for that. Richard turned back to Evelyn, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something in his expression that terrified her. Not anger, not rage, finality. "You tore her dress," he said quietly, "in my hotel, in front of cameras, in front of witnesses who will testify, in front of donors who will remember. You committed assault and battery. You caused intentional infliction of emotional distress. You violated her civil rights." Each accusation was delivered with the precision of a lawyer building a case, which made sense because Richard Harrington had 3 law degrees and had personally reviewed hundreds of thousands of contracts. He knew exactly what his wife had done and exactly what would happen next. "Security," he said, his voice carrying authority his wife's never would. "Call them." "Richard, no!" Evelyn reached for his arm. He stepped back smoothly, avoiding her touch. "Call them," he repeated to the security team. "Mrs. Harrington has committed assault. I'm pressing charges as the owner of this establishment. Miss Carter will obviously be pressing her own charges. The district attorney will undoubtedly be interested in the dozens of videos currently being uploaded to social media." He pulled out his own phone, opening it to a video that had already been shared over 1,000 times in the last 3 minutes. Evelyn's face, twisted with contempt, pulling Naomi's dress, the sound of fabric tearing, the satisfaction in her eyes afterwards. This video, he held it up for everyone to see, has already been viewed over 50,000 times. By morning, it'll be millions. By afternoon, it'll be international news, because that's what happens in our current era. Crimes don't stay hidden, especially when they're committed by people who thought their wealth made them untouchable. He looked at his wife one final time. You were wrong about Miss Carter, wrong about her status, wrong about her worth, wrong about everything. He paused. But mostly, you were wrong about yourself, about who you are, about what makes someone valuable. Evelyn's face crumpled, not with remorse, she'd need empathy for that, and there was no evidence she possessed any, but with the dawning realization that her life as she knew it was ending, right here, right now, in front of everyone who'd ever mattered to her. "I'll lose everything," she whispered. "Yes," Richard agreed, "you will, starting with me." The security team was on their radios now, calling the police as instructed. The crowd continued filming, documenting every second of a woman's fall of grace. And through it all, Naomi Carter stood quietly, Richard's jacket wrapped around her shoulders, watching justice unfold in real time. Not because she was rich, not because she was important in the way that rooms like this measured importance, but because for once there were witnesses who couldn't look away, and a man with power who chose to use it correctly. But the night wasn't over yet. The real reckoning was just beginning, and Evelyn Harrington was about to learn exactly what accountability looked like when you couldn't buy your way out of consequences. If you're still watching, you need to see what happens next. Hit that subscribe button now, because the next chapter shows what happens when the police actually arrive, when the cameras keep rolling, and when a racist socialite realizes that her money can't save her this time. Drop a comment. Do you think Richard did the right thing? Let me know below.
The shift in the ballroom's atmosphere was almost physical, like air pressure dropping before a tornado. One moment, Evelyn Harrington stood at the center of her social universe, surrounded by people who'd spent years orbiting her influence. The next, she was alone in a circle that kept expanding as guests stepped backward, creating distance between themselves and the woman who'd just become radioactive. Phones came back up, but the purpose had changed, no longer capturing entertainment, now documenting evidence. Every angle covered, every word recorded. The same people who'd stood silent while Evelyn committed assault were now ensuring their own involvement was minimized, their own reactions justified, their own faces shown in the best possible light for when this inevitably became national news. Evelyn looked around desperately, searching for allies, for her usual court of supporters who laughed at her jokes and agreed with her opinions and enabled every cruel impulse because staying in her good graces meant access to her world. They were gone. Not physically. They were still in the ballroom, still holding their champagne glasses, still wearing their designer gowns. But socially, they'd already left, already calculated the cost of defending her versus the cost of abandoning her, already chosen self-preservation over loyalty. Social calculus is brutal in its efficiency. "Someone say something," Evelyn pleaded, her voice losing its commanding edge, becoming almost childlike. "You all saw. She was walking through like she owned the place. Anyone would have made the same assumption." "We didn't make that assumption," a woman near the front said quietly. Melissa Winters, who'd been to Evelyn's house for brunch just last week, who'd called her a dear friend. "We just didn't say anything when you did." The distinction was devastating. Other voices joined in, each one distancing themselves from Evelyn's actions while simultaneously condemning themselves with every word. "I thought you were going to apologize. I wanted to stop you, but I assumed you knew something we didn't." Lies, all of them lies. They'd been entertained by the spectacle, had enjoyed watching someone else be humiliated, had felt the smug satisfaction of witnessing someone they'd decided was lesser being put in their place. They just hadn't anticipated the cameras, hadn't anticipated Richard Harrington's intervention, hadn't anticipated consequences.
Security moved through the crowd now, not toward Naomi anymore, but toward Evelyn, professional, efficient, treating her exactly as they would any other guest who'd committed assault on the premises. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to wait in the manager's office until the police arrive," one of them said. "This is ridiculous," Evelyn's voice cracked, desperation bleeding through the cultured accent she'd carefully maintained for years. "I'm Evelyn Harrington. My husband owns this hotel. You can't treat me like some common—" She stopped herself, but too late. Everyone heard what she'd been about to say. Everyone understood exactly what she thought separated her from the people she considered beneath her. Nothing but money, and the delusion that money could buy immunity from decency. Richard's expression didn't change. Escort her to the office, gently, professionally. Treat her exactly as you would any other guest who committed assault. No better, no worse. "Please, Richard." Evelyn reached for him again as security took her arms. "This is a misunderstanding. I'll apologize. I'll make this right. We can—" "There is no we anymore," Richard said quietly. "There hasn't been for a long time. I just didn't want to see it." As security led Evelyn toward the exit, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. No one wanted to be associated with her departure. No one wanted to be seen helping, defending, or even showing sympathy. She'd spent years teaching them to be ruthless in their social calculations, to value status over character, to measure worth in dollars and connections. They'd learned well. Evelyn's heels clicked against the marble floor, each step echoing in the silence. She looked back once, her perfectly styled hair disheveled now, her crimson dress that looked so powerful an hour ago, now seeming garish and desperate. "This isn't over," she said, trying to muster defiance. "My lawyers will—" "Will what?" Naomi's voice cut through the ballroom. She'd been quiet since Richard's intervention, processing everything, letting others speak, but now she stepped forward, Richard's jacket still around her shoulders, and for the first time addressed Evelyn directly. "Will claim it was a misunderstanding? That you thought I was staff, so assault was justified?" Naomi's voice was steady, controlled, but underneath was steel. "Will argue that tearing someone's clothes off in public is acceptable if you make assumptions about their worth?" She took another step forward. "I've watched the videos people are posting. I've seen your face, the satisfaction, the contempt, the absolute certainty that you had every right to humiliate me." Another step. "And you know what I realized? This isn't the first time you've done something like this. This is just the first time someone with power cared enough to stop you." The ballroom was dead silent now. Even the hired musicians had stopped playing, the catering staff frozen with trays half extended, everyone watching the confrontation between these two women whose lives had intersected so violently. "How many others?" Naomi asked. "How many people have you humiliated, dismissed, destroyed? How many staff members have you treated like dirt because you could? How many people have lost jobs because you made a phone call? How many lives have you damaged because someone didn't show you enough deference, or wore the wrong clothes, or existed in spaces you decided they didn't belong?" Evelyn's mouth opened, closed. No words came out, because they both knew the answer. Dozens, maybe hundreds over the years. People who'd been too powerless to fight back, too vulnerable to speak up, too afraid of the consequences to demand justice. "I'm pressing charges," Naomi said clearly, loud enough for every phone camera to capture. "Assault, battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress, civil rights violations, and whatever else my lawyers can think of." She looked around the crowd. "And I encourage anyone else who's been victimized by Mrs. Harrington to come forward, because I have resources now, I have witnesses now, and I'm not going to let anyone suffer what I suffered tonight in silence." The implications rippled through the ballroom like an earthquake. Other victims coming forward, other stories, other lawsuits, the entire foundation of Evelyn's social power crumbling. Sponsors who'd been standing near the donation tables began having urgent whispered conversations with their assistants. Board members of charities started distancing themselves from anything associated with the Harrington name. Guests began streaming toward the exits, suddenly eager to be anywhere else before their presence here became permanently associated with this scandal. The gala was over. Not officially, but effectively. No one cared about charity now. They cared about not being caught on camera looking complicit. Security had almost reached the exit with Evelyn when the main doors burst open, not from the inside, but from outside. Half a dozen police officers entered, moving with purpose, the kind of speed that suggested someone important had made calls. But they weren't moving toward Evelyn. They were heading straight for Richard Harrington. The lead officer, a woman with sergeant stripes and an expression that suggested she was done with wealthy people and their problems, approached Richard directly. "Mr. Harrington, I'm Sergeant Martinez. We received a call about an assault on the premises." She looked around the ballroom, taking in the cameras, the crowd, the obvious tension. "But we also received another call about you." Richard's expression didn't change. "About me?" "About threats you made to your wife, about using your position to orchestrate false charges, about witness intimidation." Martinez pulled out her phone, showing him a text thread. "These messages were sent from your phone to several board members of Mrs. Harrington's charities, threatening to pull funding unless they denounced her publicly." The ballroom exploded in whispers. Phones shifted focus again, sensing the story taking another turn. Richard looked at the phone, at messages he never sent, at threats he'd never made, and understood with perfect clarity that his wife had one final card to play. "I never sent those messages," he said calmly. "That's what they all say," Martinez replied. "But we're going to need you to come with us, answer some questions, let forensics examine your phone." Richard nodded slowly, handed his phone over without resistance. "Of course, I have nothing to hide." Naomi stepped forward. "Officer, I'm the victim here. Mr. Harrington was defending me. Ma'am, I understand and will take your statement, but right now we have to investigate all allegations equally." Martinez gestured to her officers. "Mr. Harrington, if you'll come with us." Richard looked at Naomi, his expression apologetic. "My lawyers will contact you. You'll have whatever support you need." As they led him toward the exit, Evelyn's laugh cut through the ballroom, sharp, triumphant, the sound of someone who thought they'd just pulled off an impossible reversal. "You see," she called out, her voice strengthening, "he's not the hero you think he is. He's been abusing his power, threatening people, and now you all see it." She looked at Naomi directly. "Without his protection, you're nothing, just another nobody who thought she could play in our world." The doors closed behind Richard. The crowd began murmuring, uncertain now, the narrative shifting again, some wondering if they'd been wrong, if maybe Evelyn had been right all along, if... Naomi pulled out her own phone, opened an app, and smiled. "I've been recording this entire conversation,"
she said clearly, "including your admission just now that you've been victimizing people for years, including the part where you just threatened me again." She looked at Martinez. "I assume you'd like a copy." Martinez's expression shifted. "Yes, ma'am, we would." Evelyn's face went white. "You can't, that's illegal." "Single-party consent state," Naomi replied. "I can record any conversation I'm part of, which means I have documentation of everything you've said since the assault, including your continued threats." She looked around the ballroom at all the cameras still recording. "And so does everyone else." Martinez turned to her officers. "Bring Mrs. Harrington. And get a forensics team on those text messages. I want to know who actually sent them." As they moved toward Evelyn, her expression transformed from triumph to panic. "No, wait, I can explain." But there was no explanation, no escape, no amount of money or influence that could delete dozens of videos already spreading across social media, no lawyer good enough to argue away assault caught on camera, no PR team capable of spinning this into anything other than what it was. Evelyn Harrington was led out in handcuffs, her wrists bound by metal instead of diamonds, her power dissolved, her empire crumbling. And Naomi Carter stood in the center of that golden ballroom, Richard's jacket still around her shoulders, and realized that justice sometimes did come, just not in the way anyone expected.
But outside, in the parking lot, a black SUV sat idling. Inside, someone watched the scene unfold on multiple phone streams. Someone who'd sent those text messages from Richard's phone. Someone who'd been planning this for much longer than one night. Someone who understood that the real war wasn't about one assault at one gala. It was about destroying everything the Harrington name represented. And they were just getting started.